Thank you, Christoph Ollie. Um, in the earlier testimony, I talked a little bit about the history of what we call communal violence in India, and some reference to that will be necessary. I won't go into the details, but uh, but a couple of points is necessary, I think, before we understand what happened in Delhi. That what we call riots uh, is actually increasingly rare in India. If riots suggest that people of two religious identities more or less spontaneously battle each other. We saw that happen in a very massive scale during India's partition. But as I said, in the early years after partition, we saw one phase where there was violence on both sides, but even in this stage, it was heavily weighted against the Muslim community, and the police action was again weighted against the Muslim community. We went into a second phase of large massacres, which were almost entirely one-sided against religious minorities, particularly Muslim, but also Sikhs in that phase. And then I spoke about a third phase after the Gujarat massacre in 2002, which became politically uh, very difficult for the incumbent chief minister, now India's prime minister. He was, Narendra Modi, he was denied a visa right up to the day, actually, I think he was elected prime minister, uh, and to the United States. Many European countries also did the same. Israel stood out as a very interesting exception because they invited Modi as chief minister as a very honored guest. And it was particularly ironical because, incidentally, the RSS, which is the ideological sort of forefathers, not foremothers, so of the and the sort of ideological lodestar of the BJP, uh, in its writings are frankly in great admiration of Hitler and the Nazi ideology. And when he was invited to Israel after the Gujarat massacre, uh, there were textbooks in Gujarat which actually spoke about Hitler as a great nationalist leader and many of his achievements in that regard, but actually were completely silent about the Holocaust. And so some of us wrote to the Israel embassy saying, "This is your honored guest," and they still went ahead and he continued to be an honored guest, which is ironical in so many multiple ways. But coming back, I mean, uh, so I talked about a third phase where we saw much more of, because of the political cost globally of large massacres with casualties in four figures, we saw a third phase where casualties were much smaller. They probably didn't make international headlines. They were in two digits, but the degree of bitterness of social divides, people being separated, Muslims being unwelcomed back in mixed settlements was massive in this third phase. I saw us moving to a fourth phase after Mr. Modi came to power in the center because of lynching, in one sense, one-digit casualties, but with enormous, almost unparalleled consequences of bitter divisions between the two communities. Um, that background is necessary because what we saw in Delhi, and they call the Delhi riots, were they riots? Is the first question. Uh, and to be fair, I think this was one of the rare instances of communal violence which, during the first day, looked like riots. There was damage also uh, to the local Hindu population and to their properties. But from the second day, it acquired substantially the character of a pogrom, and it went on for many days in the national capital, uh, and uh, uh, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Um, I've I've looked and studied and handled as a civil servant a number of episodes of criminal violence. I've also been a human rights worker, in a number of cases. So in many different capacities, I've looked and studied and thought about and written about criminal violence in India. Um, and somewhat similar to scholars like Paul Brass, uh, I I believe that there are three necessary conditions for communal violence to happen. Uh, the first two are necessary but not sufficient, and the third is necessary and sufficient. And I'll just elaborate that because I think I'll illustrate each of those in the context of what happened in Delhi. Uh, the first is what I call the manufacture of hatred. The premise here is that communities tend to live together, probably anywhere in the world, but I know my own country. We have a tradition, I think, unparalleled in any civilization of people of very diverse religions, cultures living together peacefully, and uh, and then there are these episodes of you know eruptions of hate. Uh, this is one part of Northeast Delhi is the largest working class and probably the poorest district within Delhi, and it has mixed populations, and it has never seen any kind of Hindu-Muslim violence. Uh, so how did it erupt? Is the question. And my observation very clearly is that uh, hatred is not spontaneous. It is not the natural condition of social relations when people of diversity live together. It is constructed, it is manufactured. And I use the word manufactured advisedly, pretty much like a chemical, reaction. I mean, organizations which are committed ideologically and politically to create communal violence know these chemical equations. How do you manufacture hatred? What do you put together? And and so that's the first necessary but not sufficient condition. And here, if you like, I don't think we have a huge amount of time. Let me also quickly uh, intersperse with how this hatred was manufactured. For that, and we need to have a little bit of context. Uh, Mr. Modi came back to power in 2019 in May with a substantially expanded mandate. Uh, it was it was a very crucial election, I think, in the journey of our republic because 2014 he did come to power with a very large majority, but it was an election where, along with a subtext of of hate being offered on the menu in the promises and the history of Mr. Modi in Gujarat, there was also promises of hope that by that time there was considerable mismanagement with the earlier government. There was despair and allegations of corruption and policy paralysis and so on. So here he promised that he would create 20 million jobs a year, the economy would be revived, corruption would be, fought, and so on. And I believe that the significant vote share, which was about 32% of India's electorate, uh, that voted for him in 2014, some of them voted for hate, but some of them did vote for hope, and for change. I would still caveat that, and some of our very respected leading intellectuals, for instance, who I think today would want to forget it, did also join in the applause, and I still believe that the history of Mr. Modi and his politics and his utterances was so clear that you may not have voted for hate, but you voted despite the offering of hate. I mean, that at least has to be admitted. But by 2019, the economy was in shambles, and there was virtually jobless growth, and crony corruption had led to new heights. The agrarian crisis was very deep. So there was no hope on offer. What was frankly on offer this time was hate against Muslims in India, hate against Pakistan across the borders, and the fact that he got an expanded mandate of 37.6% of the vote share, I think was interpreted as a mandate to implement openly the alternative idea for India as a Hindu nation rather than a secular, multicultural, multi-religious nation of equal citizenship. Now, and in the initial months, they took a number of steps which are core to the RSS agenda, especially the special status that Kashmir. Kashmir is the only Muslim majority state in the country, and they downgraded it. They took away the special status. They took away even the statehood of Kashmir and made it a territory that is directly administered by the union government. They put all the political leaders of any significance into jail or into house arrests. There was also a series of other steps, such as around triple talaq and personal law and so on. And all of these were met, it seemed, with a kind of national affirmation or endorsement. At least there was a silence, there were no protests. And I think the government was emboldened further. And a completely decisive amendment they brought in and pushed through Parliament in December 2019, which is called the Citizenship Amendment Act. Interestingly, it's just about 1,000-word law, but in its passage, effectively, the Constitution is demolished. The core of our Constitution was about this being a humane, inclusive country where people of every faith have equal rights to this country in every way. And this law, very briefly, said that India, in effect, India was posing itself to be the natural home of Hindus and not of Muslims through this law, pretty much like Israel. And so it said that from our neighboring countries, and interestingly, there are many neighboring countries, but they named three, which are Muslim majority countries: Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Incidentally, Afghanistan doesn't even share a border with us. And they said that people who are undocumented illegal migrants in this country would be fast-tracked into citizenship if they belong to various faiths except Muslim. Now, it's interesting. I mean, so the message was very clear. And it's also interesting that we have persecuted people of Muslim identity in our neighborhood, most importantly, the Rohingya. And and we have, sects like the Ahmadiyas in Pakistan, and we have various others. And all of them were excluded from this protection. So it was not a law which opened the doors in humanitarian consideration, but it was in a very openly sectarian manner, agenda. And there was the experience also of Assam, where a national register of citizenship was implemented over years and caused enormous suffering and insecurity, because it placed the burden on people to prove that they were Indian citizens and not the other way around, on the basis of vintage documents, 60, 70, 80 years old, which I couldn't muster. I mean, documents which prove my grandparents, their birth in India, and their siblings. I mean, one doesn't even know their full names sometimes, and so on. And you had to create a whole family tree with documents. So with that background, it was clear that this was, an almost lethal blow on India's promise of being a secular, inclusive country belonging to people of equally of every faith. I had, on the day that it was passed in Parliament, actually written an article, put out a tweet saying that Mahatma Gandhi has taught us the instrument of non-cooperation against unjust laws, not only as a right but as a duty. And I declare that I will non-cooperate, but also that, being a non-Muslim, I am protected because this Citizenship Amendment Act actually has created that, that I will then be drawn in and be accepted, even if I don't present documents. And so I said that I will both not present documents, but I also pledge that if religion becomes the basis of judging one's identity, I will register as Muslim. There's been a lot of discussion about it. I never said I will convert to Islam. I said I will register as Muslim in protest as an act of civil disobedience. I had imagined that this would be a voice in the wilderness necessary to make. But the country happily proved me spectacularly wrong. And we saw, the largest movement of people's resistance, non-violent people's resistance, that the country has seen since the freedom struggle, where Hindus came out in large numbers in colleges, universities across the country, and in many places outside, working class Muslim took leadership, and began a protest of which the icons became the constitution of the country, the national anthem, the national flag. And in a sense, they took back this from the Hindu nationalists, saying, this rightly belongs to us, because our flag symbolically has saffron white and green in equal measure, reflecting the idea of equal belonging and so on. And it was an extraordinary protest because, and I was, through those 100 days of protest, I was invited to speak to massive rallies of sometimes 100,000 people in far corners of the country. And they were joyous events because you could see Hindus and Muslims standing together, protesting together with the national flag. It would always end with a young girl reading out the preamble of the Constitution, and everybody, justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, and those words started having a meaning. I thought it was the most powerful rejection by the majority of the Indian people of everything that the RSS stood for. And I still believe that that movement may have been suppressed, and the riots came, and then the lockdown came, and everything was wiped out. But I think that just that assertion of solidarity nationwide is is evidence enough that, out 37.6% people voted, of which 36% significantly were Hindu. But that there are still sufficient numbers of people around the country of Hindu faith who don't believe in the agenda of the BJP RSS was demonstrated. And that, what I also spoke about in a lot, that we cannot respond to hate with hate. We have to develop a new idiom of resistance, which is founded on ideas of love and solidarity. And I think this movement demonstrated that in many ways. If it was a testimony on the movement, I could have given you many examples, but I think that background is really important. Now, what happened was that just as we saw it as a very powerful rejection of the agenda of the BJP and the RSS, they saw it the same way. And so what, the first state elections that came up, the movement started in mid-December, and through January we had people, Delhi had the coldest winter in a century, and we had working class women on the streets, and very, very inspiring sort of forms of resistance. I'll just give, in fact, one example for you to understand. They were working class women, Muslim women, taking the lead, but they understood and they practiced a very different kind of discourse. So we had union ministers, raising slogans. There's one which we talk about Muslims and the protesters, and then they say "Desh ke gaddaron ko," which means you traitors of this nation. Goli maro salon ko, you whatever XYZ people, we will shoot you with bullets. And they rouse crowds to shout these slogans. The women of Shaheen Bagh, which was one of the iconic protest sites, said we will give them a reply. And the reply slogan was actually Desh ke sab pyaron ko, oh you lovely beloved people of our country, and phool barsao saron ko, we will shower you with flowers. And I think it was it's very important to understand again what happened in Delhi. So it was this kind of resistance that was being presented. And I've seen, including the opposition to the Caravan of Love that I've been part of, and a lot of my discourse, I feel that if I talk to them also in a language of hate, they can handle it. But this, why did this ideology result in the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi? It was because he spoke about love in a very convincing way, and in a sense, they emerged as the antithesis, which was a politics of hate. And I think they were similarly unnerved hugely by this. Now, in the Delhi elections, almost became a kind of referendum on the protests. And this particular protest by Muslim women in Shaheen Bagh, it's a working class, very nondescript working class colony, where spontaneously this protest started, and then the women, and it became a place where all of us visited, the country's leading artists, singers, speakers, all would go to Shaheen Bagh and speak and express solidarity during this period. And the speeches were extraordinarily hateful by all senior leaders of the BJP. I was just, in fact, writing an op-ed a day or two ago, and I was just reading once again the kinds of hate speeches that were made. And they make your sort of skin crawl. I mean, where you have people at the rank of ministers speaking about, Muslims have not learned their lesson. We taught them a lesson in Gujarat, and we will do it again. That clearly being said. Then, all sorts of claims that Muslims will enter your homes, they'll rape your women, etc., etc. So there was this kind of discourse made at the highest levels, and this kind of sloganeering. And the Home Minister, who's right-hand man of the Prime Minister, also made speeches. One very famously, he said that press the election booth button so hard that the electric current will reach Shaheen Bagh, and so on. Now they expected to romp home with a victory. The election results came, and they were resoundingly defeated. In a historic kind of way. I think the BJP won 8 seats or something like that, and the opposition Aam Aadmi Party won about 60 seats. And it was, again, a resounding rejection. And it was, you have to understand the Delhi riots, I mean, the manufacture of hatred was through all of this, where protester is equal to Muslim, is equal to a terrorist, and a traitor to this nation. This kind of discourse was in a very shrill kind of way was unfolded. The second, I talked about 3 necessary conditions. The second condition is the organization of the riot itself. I mean, spontaneously people don't have election lists and weapons and chemicals and all of that. Mobs don't emerge from nowhere. So and Paul Brass has done a lot of what he calls riot producing machinery and so on. And that is my second observation. I said in all these capacities, as somebody who's civil servant who's handled riots, as a human rights worker who's helped people across, and as a researcher who studied criminal violence. That was very much in evidence. But the third, which I said is necessary, the first 2 are necessary but not sufficient. The third is necessary and sufficient, and that is the support of the state. And again, as a civil servant and as an observer, no so-called riot can go on for even a few hours unless the state wants it to. And I've handled riots. I was in a town called Indore in 1984 when the anti-Sikh riots happened, for instance. And again, it's a long story. And I was a young greenhorn officer who'd never seen riots, but I was horrified by what I saw. I called in the army. We had shoot at sight orders. We imposed curfew. Start to finish was 6 hours for something that could have been one of the biggest, criminal massacres in 1984. And I think that influenced me deeply because I realized how, when you look, so just come fast forward to Delhi, you're talking about the national capital of India, where government at its highest level is located. The armed forces are headquartered here. All paramilitary agencies are located here, and and this was by national standards actually a small skirmish, and we did lose 53 lives, but over many days. And it was a small skirmish. As a civil servant, it literally was a matter of 3 hours if the government had chosen to control the violence when it broke out. The fact that it went on for 5-6 days is evidence enough actually of the enabling role of the state. And then this is also the era of instant history recording through the mobile phone. You have any number of videos which show the partisan role of the police. In fact, actually instigating the rioters in many places, protecting them. The testimonies, and I was there for days and days after that, heard hundreds of people talking. The kinds of testimonies that the Muslim victims say is that both the police and the rioters would keep taunting them about the protest. Because a word that kept emerging in the protest was azadi. Azadi means freedom, and they kept saying not freedom from India, but freedom in India. And so they would say, you want azadi, and they beat them further. You had women testifying that uh, mobs of men would come and they'd say, "You want azadi?" and they'd strip down and point to their genitals and they'd say, "This is azadi," etc. Uh, so they were being punished and taunted on the one hand uh, uh, for their protests, and on the other hand for rejecting the BJP in the hustings in Delhi. Uh, uh, so 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 that's really briefly what happened. 53 people got killed, uh, and it was actually, from a personal point of view, I'll just talk about two uh, interventions in the High Court, which were very important and also indicated what was happening. So we started getting desperate calls from people there saying, the mob is coming to our house. Nobody's, protecting us. The police is just standing by. It's instigating the mob. Do something to help us. Do something to help us. We would call the police, and this is sort of admitted by the police that they had some 13,000 or something uh, calls for rescue, none of which uh, they responded to. We would keep calling the police, and nothing would happen. And so, having been in the civil service, I said the first thing you have to do is to create a control room, which is what the government should have done. So let's create a civil society control room. And at 6 o'clock, I put out a call saying I'd like some young people to come in and help set up a control room in our office. And by 8:30, there were about 40, 50 young people. And actually, they never left the office for several days after that. And the next morning, we actually bought toothbrushes and they set up a very professional kind of control room. We have details of calls we were getting, information to the police, and so on. One particularly desperate kind of calling came from a little clinic called Al Hind. Uh, and he said that 22 people who had bullet injuries came here. Two of them have already died, and I'm desperate to take them to a proper hospital. The ambulances are here, but the mobs supported by the police are not allowing ambulances to move. And even in wartime, you allow ambulances to move, but they didn't allow it. So we kept speaking to people, but nobody intervened. Uh, at about 11:30, a couple of young lawyers who were part of the group, one of them, incidentally, my daughter, but that's sort of by the way, decided that they can't handle this any longer. So they picked up the phone and they called the Delhi High Court judge, Justice Murlidhar, and said, we need to intervene, you to intervene and give directions right away. It's very important. And to their surprise, he said, can you be here in my home in half an hour? And they said, yeah, of course. And so they were there in half an hour. He got another judge. He got the registrar of the High Court. He got the clerk. He got the Joint Commissioner of Police. And he set up a full court at midnight. Heard them carefully and said, uh, immediately give protection, get the 20 people out. Their lives got saved as a result of that intervention. And in future also give necessary protections. My daughter Surur, telling us that when they went out, she was expecting some hostility from the side of the Joint Commissioner of Police. Naturally, but she said he wasn't hostile at all. In fact, he was very supportive. And having been in the system, there are good people within the system, and he was probably appalled at what was happening. And with the order of the High Court, he was able to do what was the right thing to do. So in fact, he gave her, they exchanged numbers, and he said that call me any time of the day and night, whenever you need a rescue. And so she said, give me some other people's numbers. Like, he said, no, just call me and don't worry whether it's 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock at night, I will be there. And he was true to his word. And so our control room worked. And as soon as we got a call, they would inform Surush, he would talk to the Joint Commissioner, he would send out a team. And so several hundred people got saved in that. And it's important to know that this is what elementary the state should have done, which it didn't do again. The next morning, actually, we filed a petition in the High Court in my name and one other human rights worker's name, saying that why are you not taking action against the BJP leaders who made hate speeches? And again, it's something that will go down in history, that hearing. It went to the same judge, Justice Muralidhar's court, and the Solicitor General of the Government of India, who had no business to be there, was there, and there was, and Justice Muralidhar said that, have you heard the videos of these hate speeches? He said, no, I don't watch all of this. He said, you'll watch them and you'll watch them here. And he got a TV installed. He played the videos of each of the hate speeches. And it was, a terrific kind of moment. And he said, now you tell me why you've not taken it. The police has an appropriate time to take appropriate action and so on and so forth, is what they replied. So he said, I'll give you 24 hours. And that night at midnight, he got marching orders to go from Delhi. And he's written about it as the longest working day of his life, starting from before midnight one day to midnight the next day. But it was very symbolic. And so the next morning we got a new bench and they were completely unresponsive. And among other things, somebody put in an application saying, no, but Harsh Mander gave hate speeches. And it was really extraordinary because I'd only spoken about love and solidarity. But they claimed that I was part of an urban Maoist group, whatever that is, which was planning a Leningrad siege kind of insurrection in this country, blocking all the roads, etc. And for the High Court to actually accept it, I mean, even if it was true, this is not, I mean, just because I'm a petitioner, you don't file something here, you go through legal action. So they accepted it. So it became a discussion of a hearing about hate speeches by various BJP leaders and myself, and so on. So, and then they didn't pass orders, and there's a long, and they still haven't registered even a police complaint in all of these cases of hate speech, which is again indicated. There are a number of videos which show the police actually taunting, torturing. There's one particularly painful one where they started beating this group of young Muslim men, and they were taunting them with, okay, now this is Azadi, and sing the national anthem. So prone on the ground, they were, because the national anthem had been the anthem of protest, and they were made to sing the national anthem and be beaten up. One of those men in the video, Faizan, subsequently died in police custody. No action again has been taken, and so on. So that third, the partisan role of the police was the necessary and sufficient, and the state. And it was the government allowed what was actually by any national standards a very, very small, easy local skirmish to control in a matter of, literally a matter of a couple of hours, if they chose to, was allowed to go on for several days. And then the violence was horrifying. So after that, after the first day where Muslims, because the hatred was building up through this entire election campaign, had also armed themselves with, and so there was some violence on both sides, and therefore there's some loss of Hindu life as well. But after that, it was entirely one-sided. For instance, 18 mosques were destroyed, no Hindu shrines, and so on. And bodies, then they started, again, as a result of petitioning in the courts, were being dragged out. There's a dirty drain that sort of passes through this, typically in a low-income working class colony, and dragging machines started moving, and bodies would emerge one by one from them. It was a terribly horrifying situation. What is important also is that the government did very little. It didn't, the most elementary thing then is, in the next stage, is to set up a rescue. You have, again, as an administrator, there's rescue, which they didn't do. In fact, they were blocking rescue, relief, setting up relief camps for people who, lost their homes or too frightened to return. They refused to set up relief camps, and then rehabilitation, reparation, and many other steps. So it was left again to us in civil society to try to set up relief camps for people who had either their homes. See, if you were a tenant of a Muslim tenant in a Hindu majority area, your properties were all destroyed, but the house was protected by the mob. But there was no question of your landlord letting you go back. If you were, again, living as a minority in a community with the majority, you were too frightened, even if to run away. So there was this thousands of people who were suddenly homeless overnight. And it was, it's the most obvious thing that we're trained that you set up large relief camps. But the government refused to do that. And it was left to us, as I said, and in a very poor working class locality, there were no spaces even. So it was, on the first floor of a mosque that we opened a relief camp. And it was problematic in multiple ways because the religious orthodoxies about women and various other things. And there was an Eidgah Maidan where some others opened. So it was a terrible situation. There was hunger, people who were injured. We set up medical camps, we set up legal camps. But the state was conspicuous largely by its absence. And then as fate, or whatever you would like to call it, God if you prefer, or whatever, deemed that within 1 month of the day the riot started, India went in for a nationwide lockdown. And so the little bit of work that was being mustered to support these families also became impossible. And they've had a terrible time over the last year. Some of us are volunteers. We continue to provide food relief. Some of my colleagues actually were courageous enough in the height of the lockdown and COVID to relocate and live among the survivors in their homes. And so these were the kinds of solidarities that were sort of barely possible. I had one particularly fine colleague who's also a Muslim identity, and therefore it was even harder. But he would take each injured patient. There's somebody who had acid thrown into his eyes. There were people with bullets lodged all over their bodies. And he would take them in this situation to public hospitals, face open. And the role of the doctors is also being very problematic of a lot of the doctors. There's a report on that as well, where not just the police, but also the doctors displayed sectarian hatred. And he took on the role right through the lockdown to brave all of this, to ensure that they got admitted and got treatment and so on. So this was what was unfolding. If that was the only story, it would be horrifying enough. There were two other things that are important to note in the aftermath. What the police should have been, mostly busy in trying to, and this administration, to help people during the lockdown where the economy was shut down. Instead, what they started doing was to arrest people in large numbers. And this was with the lockdown in place, and lawyers were not considered an essential service. And so they had no one to turn to. And large numbers of uh, Muslim residents, including victims, were rounded up, kept in police stations for long periods, cases were registered. And so. Now, the second and the most dangerous spin that they gave to all of this was one particular the police complaint is got a number, FIR 59. Uh, that they claimed that the riots were the result of a conspiracy by people who took a leading role in the anti-CA protests. And it was actually an insurrectionist movement. Uh, uh, and and of course, what they've said in the charge sheets finally are in some ways pretty hilarious. For instance, I'm mentioned in a number of the charge sheets, but my speeches are every one of them are recorded, so it's very hard to say I was fostering hate. So they actually said he was fostering hate behind a facade of peace, whatever that means. Also, just by the way, this misspelled peace as peach. So I was behind a facade of peach, it seems, not saffron. But and the interesting thing is that in charge sheet after charge sheet, the same lines are added with the same typo error, which is quite indicative of what they were doing. Uh, if you go through uh, these complaints, and this was the op-ed I was writing a few days ago, uh, the basic what is being alleged is that this whole enterprise was actually a seditious, treasonous, or treacherous act of terror, because we were misleading the Muslims about the law, uh, provoking them to protest, and so on. So, and and they used the anti-terror law, which is UAPA, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which allows you virtually indefinite bail, indefinite detention. The trials are not started, and it's handled by the special cell which looks after terror cases. So suddenly we are all part of this terrorist conspiracy. And many of us who are mentioned in the charge sheets, who are the so-called seniors, have still not been arrested. Although there's a clear sort of like the daggers, at a time of our choosing. But the people they've largely arrested so far are young people, student leaders, mostly women, Muslim student leaders, some Hindu student leaders, and they've these student leaders have displayed extraordinary spirit and courage through all of this. They've been quite an inspiration in many ways. I've written a lot about it, but one thing that I'd like to say, and then I'll hand over for questions, is that the police claims that there was a conspiracy behind the Delhi riots. I actually completely agree. There was indeed a very big conspiracy behind the Delhi riots, except they got the conspiracy completely wrong. And then this theory that no violence of this kind can go on for days and days. The conspiracy was really of the state, the union government, under whom the Delhi police comes, in abetting this kind of communal riots in Delhi, uh, and uh, and uh, and not providing rescue, not providing relief, that is in order to suppress, to demonize the protesters and to crush the protests. So that truly is a major conspiracy, but it's not the conspiracy they spoke of. And but the trouble is that the government is completely committed to it, and it's the starkness of the fact that many of these young people are in prison for for months and years. And on the other hand, all of these people who made open hate speeches directly instigating violence don't even have police complaints registered against them. So it's an almost shameless kind of partisan action of the state, and the state is openly, in a sense, at war with two sets of its citizens. One of it is Indian Muslims, and the other is what I call them, human rights defenders, people who believe in the constitutional promises. And we, both sets, are enemies, traitors, seditionists, insurrectionists. And I think that uh, Indian democracy has never been so badly broken as we see today. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Arsh, for this very comprehensive and very detailed testimony. Very important to have these accounts on record. And I have hardly any question to ask, except maybe two minor questions. Well, not so minor, maybe you will tell me, you will tell us. One has to do with the state, because we are in Delhi and Delhi is also a state. And there is one question that I ask myself is, what was the ARP government doing in these weeks? And the question is even more pressing because one of the BJP leaders you referred to as uttering these inflammatory speeches, Mr. Kapil Mishra, came from ARP. So the first question is it something now that goes beyond BJP and political forces are guilty of anti-Muslim attitudes similarly? And the other question that is also about the aftermath, where are these people now? Where are those who have left more than 1 year ago their house, for whom there was no relief camp? What they can't, and how many are there? Do we have any idea of the magnitude of the problem? And Muli, if you want to add your own questions now, you can please do it, or wait for our responses. It's up to you, really.
I mean, also about app, I also wanted to ask that, and to add to what Christoph just said, it's one part of it is the CAA, and like you already pointed out, the other part of the instigation, the motivation for the riots was the crushing defeat that BJP had experienced in the last election, and that's, to me, kind of actually confluences with the fact that it happened in a working class neighborhood. So there was a kind of betrayal almost by the BJP government that it expected a win from particular kinds of Hindus in particular pockets, and they didn't receive it. And so when you look at reports of whose houses or whose shops got burnt, Hindus whose shops got burnt, you see a kind of sense of a lesson being taught, a revenge being taken. And there it was because they voted for AAP, it was explicitly told to them that that is why this is being done. And so then it brings into question this idea of party solidarity and the fact that they chose AAP instead of BJP, and how that played out and what role AAP played. And of course, because it's a state, and I mean, it's a union territory, Delhi, and but it does not have control over the police. And of course, that plays a role in what you said, right, of the state's support, and it's a big role. But yeah, I mean, if you could talk a little bit more about that and about how this the later charge sheets that happened, the UAPA and the students being arrested wouldn't actually have been possible in practice without the Kejriwal government giving the green light on the Delhi police taking the cases forward. So, and I have something else to add, but after I think Harsh replies to this.
So, great and very important questions, Christoph and Molly. See, for those who are listening in who are not familiar with the specifics of India, Delhi is not a full-fledged state. It is in a very peculiar situation where many powers are retained with the union government, and particularly the police is directly not under the chief minister, but under the union home minister. And so they are directly culpable for what the police did. But having said that, it's not as if Aam Aadmi Party leadership could not have done anything. From rescue onwards, there was no bar of any kind. In fact, there was a moral responsibility that they should have played. Relief camps should have been set up by them. Relief and support should have been given by them. And that's truly the duty of the state government. I know the chief minister well. In fact, he was from the civil service. I actually trained him in the academy and so on. I was very anguished by the failure of the state government. And it was particularly ironical because the Muslim people were being punished for their support to the Aam Aadmi Party, and they were effectively abandoned by both. And at one point, I stuck my neck out. I wrote a piece in school, which is what I would have done as chief minister of Delhi, and I'm happy to look for it and send it to you. But having been again a civil servant in very troubled times during the Babri Masjid movement and so on, and you have enormous moral authority. I mean, I used to not believe in going around with security and so on, but I'd see a riot breaking out, and I would just leap into the middle, physically separate people, jump onto my jeep, and give them a speech, and people would it would have an impact. I mean, imagine if the chief minister came with his cabinet colleagues that night when ambulances were not being allowed to move, and he said, no, their lives have to be protected. I mean, there's a huge amount of moral authority even at the stage of rescue that they could have exercised. And it was also their duty. But subsequent to that, relief camps, again, I was a district officer 20, 30 years ago when we had much more limited resources in small towns. I mean, it was a different India, and you were in these small towns. But I would have been able to muster, every resource necessary for for finding places of safety for them. You have, but in Delhi, I mean, you have huge spaces. Their stadiums, their colleges were closed. Various things could have been done. You had, he just had to make a call. I want psychotherapy to be done to help people deal with grief. I want, you could have, organized legal aid camps, helping people register their complaints, the kinds of things that we did. You could have, people with injuries, but there was a clear reluctance, very visible, and I think that it's something I've written and talked about a lot. That the trouble, I mean, the situation that India's Muslims find themselves in, the primary responsibility is definitely of the BJP, but there's an enormous culpability of the so-called secular opposition, who have shown extreme moral timidity and worse, and opportunism in not speaking out, not defending. I've had many discussions with senior leaders of other leading political parties, Congress, and even the left. And one of the things they keep saying is that, you're saying this because you don't have to fight elections. And, we should just give you an election ticket and see whether you have the same. And I said that I hope I would still have exactly the same objectives. And I think it's really important at this time I keep doing so. Think of partition really. 1 million people have died in the Muslim riots. About 14 million people were displaced. It was then the largest displacement of people, apart from Africans being transported to the Americas. That level of, and a separate country was constituted on the basis of religion with rivers of blood flowing. It was very easy at that point to say, Pakistan's Muslim nation, India would be a Hindu nation. But, the courage that particularly Mahatma Gandhi displayed, and also Nehru and others, Maulana Azad. I mean, I think it's something that every later generation of Indians and people around the world should be grateful for, because if he had succumbed to what was seen as popular, he got assassinated. He knew he would, but he still, even if I'm the last person standing, I must speak for love. And there are things more important than electoral success. And my belief is that if you actually stand more, Gandhi was the most popular political leader we've had. It's not as if, and so I think that Aam Aadmi Party has done what political parties across the spectrum tend to do when confronted with taking a clear stand. It was particularly tragic here because they were being punished for their support to the Aam Aadmi Party, and this is how they were abandoned. But that's the case.
Can you say a word about where are these people now?
Yes, yeah. That was. See, we formed a group, and we are continuing to do whatever work with very limited resources, with all the lockdowns and so on. So we formed a small group of local community workers from both communities. We call them Samvidhan Sathis, but which is actually people who are upholding the constitution as being their point of departure. But they're working class, very poor, but very fine, and very fine people, who my colleagues basically observed people who displayed kindness largely in these times. So we're working through them. They've done various things. They have, for instance, this weekly women's gathering, where women are just invited to come and speak and share and so on. But even the kind of relief that we could have constructed got completely disrupted because of all of this. It's hard to give exact figures of. We are working with about 300 families, but that's still a fraction of the total. Migrants is a word that is loosely used, because migrants have shades, as of course you would know. So there's circular migrants who actually just come for a short period of time and have to go back. But you have also migrants who've come to settle here, but who have active roots in the village. And my observation, I mean, it's hard to give exact figures, but people who have places to go back to, where they can earn some kind of a living, have tended to leave. But the people who have nowhere to go, they're now living within this working class, very poor settlement. They've now carved out actually Muslim areas and Hindu areas, which was really the purpose. And gates have come up symbolically actually on lanes, and where you're keeping out the outsider. And this was not at all how they did it. So figures are hard to give, but you see, people are directly affected, but everybody, clearly if you and I live there, you'd be terrified about what can happen. Now you can no longer have faith. You don't have faith in your police. You don't have faith in the state government. You don't have faith in your neighbors. So if I have a chance, I would go away. And if I don't, then I'll move into a new way of living, which is ghettoized, and where my children will never have the chance to have friends of the other community.
Yes, this is the result of this kind of communal violence, polarization, ghettoization, and the social fabric is broken along communal lines, making the interaction even more difficult than they were before. And as you say, it's one of the purposes to break this, like to break inter-religious marriages. Same story.
And living together, I mean, in Gujarat now, because I've worked there for 10 years, what they've on later ones like Muzaffarnagar, what has happened is that when people move into Muslim majority villages, uh, they live in much harder circumstances, but they have the safety of numbers. But what they've accomplished now is that you'll have a Muslim majority settlement here, and then you have Hindu settlements across, uh, you know, 10, 15 villages. Then you have another Muslim one. So they'll never be able to take protection from each other. And they are sort of, so they've created a kind of permanent warlike situation in which Muslims will feel permanently insecure.
Yeah, in pockets, in small pockets.
Yeah.
Muli, any other question you would like to ask to Arsh?
I feel like this was a good way to wrap up things, but I was wondering if you would say something about the counter information to the anti-CAA protests that the government actually invested a lot into, because the hate speeches that came out from were not just from election rallies. What was striking to us as citizens of India, looking at the protests and then the riots from outside, was something so unique with the CAA, that there were pro-CAA protests by people who were already supporters of the government in power, which is a rather unusual thing, that the bill has already passed, it is already an act, your government is in power, and you are still calling it a protest in favor of an already existing law. And it was very strange and striking actually how they co-opted languages of the protest to build a parallel narrative of their own, and how they came up with information leaflets we thought was very interesting from the government on how to argue that the CAA is in fact not unconstitutional. So I was wondering, on ground, what you saw were the effects of this kind of information dissemination, and what have been their long-term effects now that the riots are over in that sense, and people are almost receding back to a sense of normalcy where you can stop talking about it.
So I think, what you've said is hugely accurate and observant. I think what they wanted was that there would be a Muslim version and a Hindu version on the act. And if the Muslims are unhappy, that's wonderful. I mean, that only strengthens our politics. What has sort of knocked them off is that they haven't succeeded. And so even with all this propaganda, the propaganda is useful to people who've already decided to support this government for its anti-Muslim stand, whatever it does. So it gives you a few arguments that you can put out on WhatsApp and in your groups and so on. Completely unconvincing. Where did this fear come from? And sometimes they ask me, I said, it was the Home Minister who kept using it to terrorize. And he said, note the chronology. First, we will have the CAA, then we'll have a national register, which means that first we will create a situation of safe exit for everyone except Muslims, and then we will do this. I mean, if I'm a Muslim, how can I not be frightened? And who frightened me? You frightened me. And so on. So I think that it hasn't changed. I don't think it has. It has just given instruments in this sort of shadow battle, which is about something completely different. I mean, people who don't believe in the constitution and want a Hindu nation uh, don't need arguments. Really, they're quite happy with Muslims being reduced to second class citizenship. So that I think is the reality of what has unfolded. Uh, if it's in his history, past and contemporary, that if question is one that we often advise not to ask. But if the lockdown hadn't happened, where would the protest be? My guess is, my guess is that it was not going to be crushed. And let me just, illustrate that with you know, we had this very rare instance where the Delhi High Court recently looked at the case diaries of three young people and said you haven't made any case at all. I mean, if they were protesting against a law, they have the right to do so in the constitution. If they were mobilizing people to protest, that's their right in the constitution. They were blocking traffic, admittedly, but in fact, Mr. Modi and his party and everybody else have been, it's a standard way by which protests happen in this country. So they were saying, High Court actually said what was obvious to everybody is that there's no case. So how can we keep them in custody? So these three young people have come out, but it was exhilarating to just see their body language. They're just outside. One of them, her father died about a month ago, and they hadn't given her bail, and he died, and he was a wonderful, courageous man. We have a video of him where he actually said, "I'm very proud of what my daughter is doing. I stand with her." And only towards the end, he said, "I hope I live long enough for her to come out and to see me before I die." And yet she was spirited, and she was shouting her slogans. And two of them were women, in fact, Hindu students in JNU. Completely, it was very clear that you haven't done anything, and that was what they wanted. You have done nothing to suppress my spirit. But what perhaps inspired me the most was a young Muslim boy called Asif Iqbal Tanha. He's actually comes from a very poor background. He'd come to Jamia, and his parents didn't even have money for his fees, and he used to work and so on. And they put him in jail, and he came out, and you have to wear a mask, no? So on his mask, he wrote no NRC, no CAA, and he put it on right outside the jail, and said, "I'm going to continue this battle." So to my mind, they haven't won. They can suppress, they can jail, they can call us traitors and whatever else. But I hope that India's civilizational ethos of centuries of living together with diversity as a humane, inclusive civilization will prevail.
I suggest we end on this note, Arsh, because this is exactly what we hope indeed. And your testimony again is very important for disseminating information in the first place. And also this kind of hope, because you do not only testify on what happened, but also on what you did. And therefore, we have the two faces of that coin, which are so important, because it's not only a problem, but also a solution that is presented by you. So I will stop recording now, except if you have any pressing question or remark.
No, I think I said I had to say thanks.
Yeah,